The crown, a circlet of gold and grief, settled on her brow at 5. Not a queen, not yet a woman, merely a child in a gown woven for treaties, not for play. Her small feet dangled, a silent pendulum, as she sat beside him, a boy twice her age, or a man 3 times, depending on the shifting sands of alliance. The Latin contract, a labyrinth of land grants and bloodlines bartered by fathers and uncles, meant nothing. But the crushing weight of the silk, the suffocating silence of her mother, these she understood. They dressed her as a bride, spoke to her as an offering, led her down the cold stone corridor like a lamb to slaughter. Deep within the cathedral, incense choked the air, bells pealed a hollow triumph. Nobles smiled, their teeth like polished bone. And the girl, mute, blinking, fresh from the nursery, was wedded to a kingdom she would never truly rule. This was no rare tragedy. It was the very blueprint of power. A girl of noble blood was not born to live. She was born to carry a treaty in her womb. One day, perhaps, a son would grant her the right to breathe. Until then, she was to be pure, obedient, and silent. The ceremony was called holy, ordained by God. What god, she wondered, would sanction the binding of a toddler to a throne she couldn't even pronounce? She sat in her own wedding like a porcelain doll, lips parched, legs numb, the unintelligible Latin a drone against the clinking toasts to her future fertility. Later that night, as the great hall still echoed with the drunken roar of pride, she lay alone in a vast bed, velvet drapes drawn like a shroud around her. The servants had vanished, candles guttered low. The sheets, too clean, swallowed her small form. Records exist of these unions, signed documents, scribes meticulously noting dowries and inheritance, but they did not record the frantic beat of her heart, or the way she bit her lip until it bled, stifling a cry as the bishop placed her tiny hand into the rough, wrinkled palm of a man 30 years her senior. No one asked her what she wanted. No one explained what came next. Her voice was a whisper unheard. Her body, a territory claimed. Her future, a negotiation sealed over banquet tables, traded for land and alliance. Childhood was a luxury of the poor. For royal girls, it was a brief, inconvenient mistake, corrected swiftly with a ring and a crown. The gown, sewn with threads of gold, was heavier than she could bear. A nurse had to guide her down the aisle, yet she smiled, for duty demanded beauty, demanded goodness. Her silence was praised, her obedience meticulously recorded, her fear utterly ignored. And so the child in the wedding dress became a queen in title, a prisoner in truth. Freedom would be a myth, a whispered dream, not in the manicured gardens nor the castle's echoing corridors, not even in the cold sanctuary of her own bed. Her story, like countless others, would be lost in the margins of men's triumphs, forgotten until the bleeding began. What came next was inevitable. Once the vows were spoken, once the bloodline was secured, her true value would be measured not by virtue, but by her womb. As she grew, too quickly, too quietly, the world's gaze would fix on her stomach, watching, waiting. She would not be allowed to remain a child, not when sworn to a crown, not when her worth was signed away in ink, sealed with the insignia of kings. By 11, she would be pregnant. Still playing with dolls, the whispers began. Soft voices in shadowed corridors, behind tapestries, in the corners of candlelit chambers, whispers that she had begun to bleed. No one congratulated her directly. Smiles were exchanged between others. Matrons nodded with knowing approval. Priests spoke of divine timing. And the men began to speak of heirs, of consummation, of bedding, of breeding. She had crossed the invisible line that had always loomed. Girl, no longer. Woman, not yet. But womb, suddenly, urgently, unmistakably. Her body ached. She didn't know why. The blood frightened her. She thought she was dying. She told a servant, who told a lady-in-waiting, who told the steward, who told the Lord. By evening, the household knew. The queen was fertile. The marriage could be consummated. She was not allowed to cry. The bridal bed was prepared again, not for ceremony, but for confirmation. White sheets, quiet prayers, a basin of water placed at the foot of the bed. Evidence would be required. Legitimacy demanded proof. No one asked if she understood. The midwife, a shadow in the flickering light, told her it would hurt, but only briefly, that it was her duty, that queens were made this way, that this was how history began. And so she lay there, small, shaking, skin still warm from the sun of a childhood not yet fully surrendered, and waited. She was 11. Some girls did not survive their first pregnancies, hips too narrow, hearts too frail, lungs unprepared for the strain. But these were risks the court was willing to take. A dead child bride could be replaced. A successful heir, however, was worth the gamble. The moment she missed her courses, the court erupted in quiet celebration. The whispers returned, now laced with glee. Dresses were sewn, musicians hired. The queen was expecting. A procession of doctors, priests, and noblewomen invaded her chambers daily. She found no peace. Her body no longer hers, but a vessel for the future. Every inch her belly swelled was praised, her quiet pain dismissed as royal composure. When she vomited, they called it noble suffering. When she cried, they blamed hormones. When she screamed in labor, they called her weak. Hours bled into days, the pain was endless. And when it came, when the baby emerged, covered in blood and silence, it was not a boy. The room froze. No songs were sung, no bells rang. Physicians exchanged grim glances. Another attempt would be necessary. They handed her the child, small, crying, unloved, and told her she had failed, though the word was unspoken. Then they took the baby away. She closed her eyes, trying to return to the last moment she had been a child, the garden, the doll, the soft hands of her mother brushing her hair. But it was too far now. She had been stretched, emptied, broken open for a future that would never remember her name. She would try again and again, until she delivered a son or until she died trying. The crown did not wait. The court did not care. The womb had spoken, but not yet in the right language. And so at 11 years old, she was already a mother, but still not enough. She was no longer seen for what she was, a child bruised by a crown, but for what she might still produce. Her girlhood, whatever scraps remained, had been overwritten by lineage. She was not a person anymore. She was a vessel, a hinge in the architecture of empire, a corridor between two royal houses. Her smile didn't matter. Her mind didn't matter. Only her blood and what it might carry. Her name was spoken with reverence in foreign courts, not for her achievement, but for her ancestry. They traced her lineage on parchment like sacred scripture, winding through fathers, grandfathers, and long-dead kings, as if these invisible men justified the trembling breath inside her. They didn't speak of her voice. They spoke of her dowry. They didn't ask how she slept at night. They asked whether her father had claims in Aquitaine. At banquets, she was seated beside men decades older. They offered toasts to her fertility. She bowed and said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence earned safety, or at least less suffering. And when they touched her hand, speaking of the strength of her blood, she didn't flinch, knowing they weren't speaking to her, but to the idea of her, the idea of what her womb might forge. All across Europe, girls like her were traded like relics, from Castile to Brittany, from Burgundy to Aragon, each with a crown too heavy for their necks, with eyes that dulled too early. Some died in childbirth before they turned 12. Others were widowed before their first kiss, and some, the lucky ones, lived long enough to become ghosts inside their own skin, shadows beside thrones they were never allowed to touch. Sometimes they were brought out for processions, dressed in crimson silk, mounted on palfreys, waved to by crowds who knew nothing of their pain. The people would cheer, the nobles would nod, and somewhere beneath the jewels and powder and embroidery, a girl would be hiding, trying to survive, trying to remember her own name.
They called it duty. They called it destiny. They called it divine order. But it was conquest wrapped in piety. It was patriarchy dressed in velvet. A girl's innocence was not just dismissed, it was considered a weakness to be purged. Girlhood was irrelevant. Girlhood was inconvenient. Girlhood was sacrificed on the altar of alliance. And still, they wrote about them as if they were born lucky, as if a castle could compensate for a childhood, as if a crown could warm a cold bed, as if their short lives, brutal, blood-soaked, and buried under protocol, were something to envy. Her daughter, if she survived, would be next. That was the unspoken rule. The bloodline must continue, and for it to continue, more girlhoods must be surrendered, more childhoods carved into treaties, more little hands bound in holy matrimony before they ever learned to write. And so she stayed silent, because to speak was to betray what she had been taught, that she was lucky, that she was chosen, that there was no higher honor than to disappear into history for the sake of men's power. But late at night, when the halls were still and the fire had died to ash, she would sometimes press her hand to her belly and wonder, not if the child would be royal, but if the child would be free. They paraded her like a prize, untouched and unblemished, a virgin queen in title, if not in name. Men at court spoke of her purity as if it were currency, delicate, dangerous, sacred. But beneath their reverence lay cold calculation. Purity was only valuable so long as it could be spent, and they planned to spend it on alliances, on conquests, on crowns they hadn't yet stolen. She had been trained to speak softly and smile through discomfort. Her tutors had taught her languages, but not her own voice. Her handlers, governesses, bishops, aging nobles had told her that her virtue was her greatest weapon, and she began to believe them, for she had nothing else to believe in. When foreign ambassadors arrived, they bowed not to her intellect or charm, but to her potential. She was a sealed letter, a locked chest, a field yet to be plowed. They used phrases like untouched and ripe for alliance, as if her body were a tract of land waiting to be claimed. She was 12, maybe 13. Paintings were commissioned not to capture her soul, but to advertise her waistline, her skin tone, the set of her jaw. Her portraits were sent across Europe like marriage proposals dipped in gold leaf. Kings, old enough to be her grandfather, examined her face with military intent. Princes debated her bloodline as if reading a livestock chart. She became a phantom in conversation, her name spoken often, but never in her presence. Always she, never I. When suitors arrived in person, they leered behind smiles. They danced with her under candlelight and whispered promises in her ear, promises she couldn't decipher but knew to fear. Some brought gifts, gowns, rings, even exotic animals. She was told to thank them, curtsy, and accept the lie that this was courtship, that this was affection. But she knew, deep down she always knew, her value existed only in contrast. She was praised for what had not yet been taken from her, but the praise was a noose, because the moment her virtue was spent, by marriage, by politics, by force, her pedestal would collapse, and she would become what so many queens had become before her, property with memories, political meat. Some resisted. There were girls who refused to marry, who tried to run, who cried loud enough to disturb the ceremonies, but their names were erased, or worse, remembered only in disgrace. The virgin who defied the match was not seen as brave, she was seen as broken. So most obeyed, taught to equate obedience with survival. And when the match was made, when the ceremony was set, they stepped forward, offered their hands, and let themselves be devoured by dynasties. And if they were lucky, if the man was kind, if the pregnancy didn't kill them, If the court didn't turn against them, they were allowed to live out their days in a gilded cell, praised as virtuous until someone younger, purer, more politically convenient came along. She was told that queens shape history, but what she saw was that history shaped them into pawns, into icons, into wombs. The ones who survived were not the ones who ruled, they were the ones who endured. And behind the silks, beneath the jeweled headdresses, in the quiet spaces between power and pain, there was always the same silent question. What does it mean to be worshipped only for what you haven't yet lost? It always came down to numbers. Before the ring, before the bed, before the child was even old enough to bleed, there was the dowry. Lines inked by scribes, coins tallied, territories mapped, the cost of a girl's life reduced to cattle, gold, or borderlands. No one asked if she wanted the man. They asked if her father could pay for him. She would sit in the corner of the hall, legs folded, quiet as the men spoke above her. They'd haggle like traders in a market. Too high, too far, not fertile enough, not noble enough. One offered Navarre, another demanded Burgundy. A third asked for nothing but her bloodline and a safe route through the Pyrenees. They all agreed on one thing: she wouldn't get a say. The dowry wasn't a gift, it was a ransom, an offering to prove the girl was worth the risk, that her womb would be fruitful, that her family was invested, that her obedience was guaranteed. And if she failed, if she didn't bear sons, or her family lost power, or her husband grew bored, he could send her back like damaged goods. Some queens lived their entire lives in limbo, neither wife nor widow, bouncing between courts as pawns too expensive to discard, but never valuable enough to cherish. The richer the dowry, the more brutal the expectation. A girl purchased with a province had to earn it back in heirs. One child wouldn't do, two might not be enough. She was expected to breed security, to produce not only sons, but peace. Some fathers bankrupted their kingdoms to buy a throne for their daughters. Others used daughters as bribes to keep rival houses at bay. The girl herself became a currency of compromise, flesh for favor, silence for survival. They dressed it in grandeur, the signing of the betrothal papers, the feasts, the applause. But beneath the ceremony, the truth was cold. She was being sold, piece by piece, to a future carved by the hands of men who would never bleed for it. And when the negotiation stalled, when one crown demanded more land and the other hesitated, the girl waited in limbo, half promised, half forgotten. Not a child, not a bride, just an object sitting in a ledger, waiting to be moved. Sometimes she prayed, not for freedom, she didn't know what that looked like, but for mercy, for a husband who might be gentle, for a childbirth that wouldn't end in her burial, for a life that might allow her just once to laugh without consequence. But prayer was not part of the contract, only dowries were. And when the agreement was struck, when the ink dried and the coins changed hands, she smiled, bowed her head, and prepared for the next part of her undoing. Because no matter how gilded the bed or embroidered the gown, she knew the truth. She had just been bought. The ink had dried, but the debt had only begun. The court called it a triumph.
Trumpets blared, bells rang out from cathedrals that had buried more girls than they'd ever saved. Her father toasted to the union, his lips stained with wine, his eyes sharp with relief. He had secured the alliance, secured the future, secured, above all, the disposal of his daughter in the most advantageous direction. But behind the curtains of celebration, another reality began to unfold. A dowry wasn't just a sum, it was a promise, and promises had teeth. The payments rarely ended with the wedding. Territories had to be transferred, troops committed, taxes extracted from peasants to pay for silks and shipping crates and bridal parades.
Her marriage had not only tethered her body, it tethered economies. If a single clause of the contract went unmet, it could spark war. If her family defaulted on a payment, she would be blamed. Not her father, not the treasurer, her. And in her new court, she was reminded of that debt every day. The queen with the large dowry became a target. She was not a beloved wife, but a ticking ledger. Her in-laws monitored her every move. Did she look grateful enough? Was she bearing children fast enough? Was she still obedient? The moment she faltered, if her tongue slipped or her fertility slowed, the whispers would start. She cost us too much. She hasn't delivered. She's bleeding the crown dry. And the thing about dowries was they could be reclaimed. Some queens were sent back home in disgrace, dragging their humiliated fathers into fresh debt. Some were imprisoned, accused of witchcraft or adultery when the money ran out. Others simply disappeared, their names struck from court records, their bodies buried in convents or forgotten towers. The lucky ones remained married, unloved, untouched, watched like livestock, but technically still queens. They learned to play their roles carefully, to smile on cue and produce heirs like seasonal crops. They wore jewels around their throats and called them gifts, though they felt more like chains. She kept her eyes low at banquets. She said little in court. She learned which servants she could trust and which walls had ears. When her husband ignored her, she was grateful. When he touched her, she endured. When he asked for more sons, she tried. Sometimes she thought of home, not with longing, but with bitterness. She remembered the day the marriage contract arrived, the way her mother had smoothed her hair and whispered, "You will do great things." But the only great thing she had done was disappear. And still the crown on her head gleamed. The people cheered when she appeared on the balcony. They called her graceful, pious, generous. They never saw the girl underneath, just a queen, a dowry fulfilled, a treaty alive, a product that had not yet broken. The sheets were always cold. No matter how many furs were layered atop them, how many braziers burned through the night, the chill remained. It wasn't the stone walls or the draft crawling in from the castle windows. It was the absence, the echoing absence of affection, of touch given freely, of love without obligation. She lay on one side of the bed, staring at the canopy overhead, her hands folded over her stomach, waiting for the man whose name she had taken, the man whose child she was expected to carry. Sometimes he came, sometimes he didn't. And when he did, it was mechanical, rehearsed, as if checking a duty off a list. She stopped bracing for tenderness. There was none. They said marriage was sacred, that it bound two souls. But hers had been bartered, bought, and bound before she could spell her own name. What existed in this chamber wasn't union, it was transaction. She belonged to him in the way land belongs to a lord, usable, expected to produce, replaceable if it failed. On the nights he stayed away, she was not relieved. She was anxious, because an absent husband bred suspicion, and suspicion bred blame. It would be her fault somehow. Her face, her mood, her womb. Court gossip had sharp teeth, and even silence could be fatal. She had no power to resist him, nor to summon him. She only had the power to endure. Some nights she wept quietly, turning her face to the pillow to muffle the sound. On others, she stared out at the moon, wondering if there were other girls like her, lying awake in other castles, wearing the same crown of quiet misery. She imagined them, 1,000 queens in 1,000 beds, all playing the part history demanded, while their bodies went numb. The midwives came often, checking for signs. Had her appetite changed? Did she feel movement? Was her belly growing? No. Then try again. Keep trying. The kingdom is waiting. Her husband spoke to her rarely in public. When he did, it was as one might address a servant, politely, dismissively, without curiosity. She had learned to speak only when spoken to compliment his hunts, his victories, his choices, to laugh when others laughed, to smile when introduced. But at night, when the servants left and the doors were shut, she was alone with the raw weight of her reality. She had been raised to see this as duty, as privilege, but privilege didn't warm the skin. It didn't soften the blow of cold hands, or avert the gaze that saw her not as a person, but as a function. The cold bed became her kingdom, a silent realm of ritual and expectation, and like every queen before her, she ruled it with stillness. Sometimes she imagined what it would be like to be held, not possessed, not used, but held, as a girl, as a woman, as someone who could choose. But in the world she had been born into, choice was treason, and dreams were dangerous. So she stayed still, silent, and waited for the next knock at the door. The first time her body broke, no one flinched. The bleeding began in the dark, thick and sudden, soaking through layers of linen. The sheets were stripped before sunrise. The servants were silent. A priest was called before a physician. And when she woke, pale, sweating, eyes unfocused, no one told her what had happened, only that she had disappointed God. The baby was gone. She hadn't even felt it move yet. They told her it was common, that royal women lost children often, that the first one was never certain, that it would not be spoken of again. And it wasn't. Not in court, not in prayer, not even in the quiet between women. The pain was buried beneath embroidery and ceremony, and she was expected to stand tall again the next morning, smile, wave, sit beside her husband, as if her body had not just failed the realm, but something inside her had changed. Her steps became slower, her laughter more forced. She began to feel the soft ache in her stomach, to flinch at the sight of blood. And yet, when the swelling returned months later, the entire court rejoiced. She did not. Her body, still tender from grief, was once again paraded as a symbol. Again midwives hovered. Again the old women patted her hands and spoke of sons and saints. And again she bore it all quietly, because that was what queens did. They bore things, children, pressure, pain. This time she was further along. She felt it move, a flutter, then a kick. She even smiled once when it hiccuped beneath her ribs. She dared to imagine a name, a future. And then again it ended. More blood, more silence, but less ceremony this time. No priest, just whispers, suspicion, fear. Some said she was cursed. Others said her family's blood was too thin. One advisor hinted that her husband might seek another, one more capable. And she, still bleeding, still shaking, was told to get up, to bathe, to attend vespers, and to wear blue, always blue. It made her look more fertile. She walked the halls like a ghost in silk, the queen consort of a country that no longer believed in her. They began feeding her strange tonics, bitter herbs and holy relics boiled into drinks. They burned incense in her bedchamber, hung charms above the door.
One midwife whispered that it was her fault for reading too much, for writing poetry, for thinking too deeply, that her womb was confused by ambition. And still, her body kept trying. It stretched, it tore, it healed wrong. She coughed blood for weeks after her third loss. Her teeth ached, her hair thinned, and the physicians called it womanhood. The bed that had once been cold became a battlefield. Every visit from her husband another summons to war. And still she obeyed. Still she smiled. Still she told the world she was happy. But the crown on her head began to tilt. The court watched her with pity now, not pride.
The tapestries were still embroidered with lions and lilies, but the real message was clear. A queen who could not breed was a queen who could not reign. And so she wrapped her broken ribs, painted her lips, brushed powder over the circles beneath her eyes. She held court as expected, even as her hands trembled under the weight of an empty cradle, because the illusion of power was the only power she had left. The fourth time there was no ceremony, no midwives waiting, no bells prepared to ring, just a slow unraveling, quiet, internal, invisible to all but her. She didn't tell anyone, not at first. She couldn't bear to see the familiar flicker of disappointment pass across the physician's face, or the cold recalculations in her husband's eyes. Instead, she wore thicker dresses, stayed seated longer during audiences, claimed dizziness when asked to dance. And when the bleeding started again, this time even earlier, she simply sat with it, alone. No screams, no prayers, just a soft, dull acceptance, like a page turning in a book she'd read too many times. By now, her body was no longer hers in the eyes of the court. It was public property, a failed investment. Whispers filled the corridors. The queen is barren, some said. Others suggested witchcraft, poison, divine punishment. A noblewoman quietly advised her to seek help from an apothecary in secret, to consider darker options, remedies whispered about by chambermaids and common wives. But she had no room left for rebellion, only ritual. She was still forced to attend christenings of other children, nieces, cousins, bastards legitimized for political convenience. She would hold them, smile for the paintings, pose in her embroidered silks, while her arms ached for what had never stayed. Every coo, every cry pressed harder into the hollow space beneath her ribs. The king, once indifferent, now grew cold. He began to spend more nights away. Rumors rose of mistresses, of quiet bribes to ensure loyalty should a second marriage be needed. He never said it aloud. He didn't need to. Power speaks in absences. And still she remained, because a queen couldn't disappear. But she had, not in body, but in presence. She was a ceremonial object now, dressed in brocade, presented like an heirloom, smiled at, bowed to, but never truly seen. Her name was invoked during treaties and masses, embroidered on festival banners, carved into new cathedrals. But no one asked how she slept at night, or if she still bled. The mirror became her only confidant. In it, she saw the ghost of a girl who once believed her pain had purpose, that all the suffering would lead to something. If not love, then legacy. But now even legacy seemed out of reach. No child, no heir, just the slow withering of a crown placed on brittle bones. Sometimes she would run her fingers across her belly where the scars had begun to form under the skin, not from knives, but from grief, the kind of grief that calcifies, that hardens like stone around the heart. She didn't cry anymore, not because she had grown strong, but because she had grown numb. And the court carried on. Dresses were made, balls were hosted, portraits painted. History would remember her title, her lineage, perhaps even the treaty signed in her name. But it would not remember her pain. It would not remember the way her hands trembled as she folded away yet another baby gown, or the night she pressed her face into a pillow to muffle the sobs, or the moment she realized that in a world ruled by bloodlines, her body was the battlefield and the blame. Broken bodies make fragile crowns, and hers was beginning to slip. She was not the first queen to be locked away while carrying a child, but few had been so young or so utterly forgotten. The walls of her chamber were high and damp, carved stone draped in mildew. The air clung to her skin like sorrow. She slept alone now, guarded not by handmaidens, but by silence, and watched not by ladies in waiting, but by suspicion. The crown that had once been her cage had been taken off, but the weight remained, pressed into her bones, etched into her breath, curdled in her womb. No one visited unless summoned. No one touched her unless ordered. Her meals were brought without words. Her body, once paraded as holy and fertile, was now treated as a liability, an object under quarantine, not because she was dangerous, but because she was no longer useful. A queen fallen out of favor, a girl who had failed to deliver peace. And yet, inside her, life stirred. It kicked against her ribs in the stillness of midnight, like a protest from within. She sometimes placed her hands around her belly and whispered to it, not with joy, but with fear. What would happen if the child was a girl? What would happen if it was a boy? Would that save her or seal her fate? She had no answer, only memories. She remembered the ceremony, the feast, the glittering court that celebrated her pregnancy before it had even begun. She had been praised for the roundness of her belly, the glow of her skin. Old men toasted to her uterus, speaking as if her body was a vessel for a future that belonged to them. But now those same men had vanished. The court had turned, the wind had changed. She had been accused of betrayal or failure or simply of being inconvenient. The charges were never clear, never spoken aloud, only implied through the looks, the confinement, the way her name was suddenly absent from the prayers set at chapel. And so she waited, pregnant, alone, watched. Sometimes she wondered if she would be allowed to live whence the child came, if she would be sent to a convent or to the block, if the child would be taken from her arms and raised by strangers, shaped into something palatable, obedient, untainted by her disgrace. There were rumors of other women like her, princesses exiled in towers, queens imprisoned in castles by husbands or councils or brothers, forgotten figures whose children were raised without them. Some of those children became kings, others became legends, but the mothers, they vanished. She pressed her forehead to the cold wall and tried to imagine what freedom might feel like. She couldn't remember. Her life had never belonged to her. It had always been the property of men with parchment and power. Now she belonged to no one, not even to herself, only to the child growing inside her. That child, she whispered, might change everything, or nothing at all. But for now it was the only warmth left in her world, the only heartbeat she trusted.
He died in the night. She wasn't there when it happened. No one thought to wake her. At 12 years old, she was a widow before she had even begun to understand what it meant to be a wife. The servants moved like shadows that morning, faces solemn but careful not to meet her eyes. Something had changed, something irreversible. They dressed her in black before telling her why. Her hair was braided with mourning ribbons, her gown heavy with embroidered sorrow. She sat small and stiff on the edge of a grand chair that swallowed her whole, while a priest mumbled words about heaven and sacrifice. No one asked how she felt. No one mentioned that the man they were grieving had been a stranger to her. Twice her age, barely present,
and yet the axis of her fate.
The title they had given her was now an epitaph. Queen consort, widow, useless. They sent her away not long after. The palace that had once been her golden prison no longer needed her, and her presence made the new order uncomfortable, a reminder of what had failed, of a union that had not borne fruit. She was escorted to a quieter estate, a countryside fortress, where the wind blew hard against the shutters, and the walls seemed to lean inward with judgment. There was no ceremony for her departure, no carriage lined with velvet, no farewell from the court, just a bag of plain garments, a single maid who refused to speak, and the sound of hooves on dirt as she was removed like an error. At the estate they called her my lady, but never queen. The grander title was too generous, too official, too dangerous. She was not to be seen as a royal anymore, only as a memory, and not even a meaningful one. She spent her days in a small stone room that smelled of smoke and damp wood. The windows were narrow, too high to look through without standing on a stool. The fire never seemed to warm the corners. Meals were delivered through a servant's hand, never a face. She was alone, but never unwatched. Her name still traveled through whispers, at court, in foreign lands, among ambassadors who wondered what would be done with her now. Some said she might be married off again. Others said she was cursed, a barren child wife twice discarded. Her youth no longer shielded her. It only made the tragedy more grotesque. She tried to write once, a letter to her mother, but it was intercepted. Inappropriate, they said, too emotional. Better to focus on prayer, on obedience, on preparing her soul for God's will, though no one seemed interested in what God's will might be for a girl buried alive. She bled for the first time that winter, alone in a room without candles. She tore strips from her underdress and cried into the sleeves. She thought perhaps it meant she was finally a woman, but there was no celebration, no feast, no welcoming into the ranks of queens or mothers, only a deeper silence, a colder cold. She was 12, a widow, unclaimed, unwanted. And yet her name would live on in records, in treaties, in the margins of royal genealogies, as a footnote, a misstep, a girl who wore a crown too soon and lost it before she knew how heavy it truly was. They said she had been fortunate to marry well, fortunate to be elevated, fortunate to survive. But survival was not life, not when it came with this much silence, not when it tasted like ash. She looked out at the snow beyond the window, soft, white, indifferent, and wondered how many more winters she would live through without ever again being seen. There were others. Their names were not carved into marble, nor etched into gold-lined manuscripts. No portraits of them hung in great halls. No poet sang of their virtue. They were the ones who slipped through the cracks of empire. The silent queens, the discarded princesses, the girls whose marriages were never consummated, or whose wombs failed the crown, or whose fathers died before their dowries were paid. They existed in shadows, in convents, in distant estates, in locked towers behind ivy-covered walls. They had once been promised everything, titles, lands, sons, immortality. But promises rot quickly in royal courts, especially when they are made to girls. Some of them were never even told they had been married. The contracts were signed when they were toddlers, sealed with wax and ambition, binding them to men they would never meet. When the collapse collapsed, they were simply forgotten, dressed in faded silks, taught to curtsy and pray, and then left behind when the carriages rolled on without them. Others were used once, paraded into courtrooms as political symbols, paraded out again when their purpose expired. a French bride sent to a Spanish king who died before the wedding, an Italian duchess whose dowry was spent before her ship ever landed, a Portuguese girl who spoke no German and was locked in a tower for refusing to convert. No one wrote their history. Their voices echo only in the letters they tried to send, pleas to fathers, brothers, popes. Most were never answered. Some never arrived. One girl is said to have written the same sentence over and over for 6 months, hundreds of pages delivered to no one. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. These weren't the queens whose names became dynasties. They were the human collateral behind dynasties, bargaining chips that were misplaced, broken, or simply outlived their usefulness. And yet, for a moment, they were royal. For a heartbeat, they were everything. A feast had been thrown in their name, a gown sewn just for their tiny frame. A priest had spoken of duty and sacrifice, while a girl with shaking hands was led toward a man twice her age. She had believed, for a time, that she mattered, that the pageantry meant permanence. Then came the silence. Some turned to God. They shaved their heads, took new names, and tried to scrub away the memory of the crown. Others went mad. One tried to set fire to her sheets, claiming the Virgin Mary told her she was already dead. Another grew mute for years, communicating only through the arrangement of pins on her bodice. And some simply endured, lived into old age in dusty rooms, known only by the title they had once been given, Lady So-and-so, widow of what's-his-name. Their faces faded from memory, their voices forgotten in the rush of louder wars and more famous queens. History prefers its heroines, bloody or beautiful. It has little use for the quiet, broken, inconvenient ones. But they were real. They bled. They dreamed. They loved. They lost. And they waited for recognition, for rescue, for anything beyond the hollow echo of being born royal in a world that didn't want them. They were forgotten, but they are not gone. There were so many of them, not just queens, but children shaped into chess pieces before they learned to read, their bodies dressed in silk, their minds shackled with scripture, their futures signed away with a wax seal. Some were sent to foreign courts and never heard their native tongue again. Others remained locked in their fathers' castles, waiting for a wedding that never came. And when history moved on, it left them behind. Some were born into greatness, only to be buried under it. The 5th daughter of a minor king promised to a cousin in Hungary who died of fever before she turned 9. A girl groomed to become empress, only to find her betrothal revoked when her father lost a war. A princess born during a famine, too expensive to marry off, too noble to be dismissed. She was 12 when they sent her to a convent. She died there, nameless in the records, remembered only by a single rosary found under her pillow. Others were destroyed by childbirth, not the bloody spectacle of a queen giving birth under a canopy of gold, but the hidden kind, the kind where a girl, not yet grown, was forced into a marriage bed and left to labor in silence. Some bled out before the sun rose. Some were ripped apart trying to deliver children whose heads were too large for their hips. And yet when they died, the chronicles rarely recorded their names. Only the line, "She died in childbed." As if that explained anything, as if that was all they were meant for. A few, by accident or defiance, survived long enough to watch the world forget them. They lived in back corridors of courts that no longer acknowledged their titles. They watched younger girls take their place, new brides with brighter eyes, stronger wombs, larger dowries. They learned to stay quiet, to nod, to sip from gilded cups, and say nothing of the ghosts that clung to them. Some grew cruel, others grew devout. A few simply vanished into rumor, disappearing from paintings, their portraits painted over, their names scrubbed from the genealogies. Every royal family had one.
the disappointment, the misstep, the girl who didn't fulfill her purpose. She may have once worn a crown, but she died in silence. Even the stones forget. And yet they remain, beneath our stories, between our wars, in the footnotes and margins of empires. The forgotten ones, the girls who were never allowed to grow into women. The women who were never allowed to grow old. The queens who bore no heir. The wives who spoke too loudly. The daughters who wept on their wedding night and were scolded for it. They did not shape history. They were crushed by it. But their absence is its own kind of legacy. The weight of their silence still presses against the walls of palaces. It lingers in the hush between verses and royal anthems. It stains the hem of every coronation robe. They may be forgotten, but they are still. Centuries passed, stones crumbled, thrones changed hands, kingdoms became nations, but their names were still missing. Their voices had been swallowed by dust, their lives reduced to titles: daughter of, consort to, mother of none. They became shadows behind louder men, footnotes to male ambition, sacrificed on the altar of dynastic survival. But silence, like stone, can fracture, and cracks had begun to show. It started in archives, in brittle letters folded into forgotten ledgers, penned in a girl's hand. Pleas, prayers, secrets written in ink so faint it nearly vanished. One begged her father not to send her to Spain. Another described the taste of poppy milk fed to her after she lost her child. A third, unsigned, untranslated, was a single line repeated 13 times. My name is not a bargain. Historians found them, women mostly, sifting through boxes in church basements, in the dusty corners of national libraries. They found traces of the forgotten, not in grand proclamations, but in margins, in the slant of a quill, in misspelled Latin. And from those fragments, a different story emerged. Not of queens who ruled, but of queens who endured. Girls whose worth was measured in coin and womb, who bled quietly into sheets while ambassadors toasted peace in the next room. Who were married at 5, pregnant at 11, widowed at 12, and erased by 15. Who sat in cold stone towers and dared to hope that someone, someday, would remember they had once laughed, once read poetry, once stared out at the sea and wondered what might have been. Their silence was never passive. It was enforced. And yet now it was being rewritten, not with triumph, but with truth. Not to elevate them into saints or martyrs, but to let them be human, flawed, brave, trapped, brilliant, afraid. Some of them hated their roles, others clung to them. Some fought, some surrendered. Some died without ever understanding why they had been chosen. Others lived long enough to watch their children repeat the same wounds. But now their names return, not as trophies of bloodlines, but as echoes of resistance. Their stories slip into documentaries, novels, museum exhibits. People light candles beside plaques bearing their names. Artists paint them not as queens, but as girls with chapped lips, bruised hands, and eyes that refuse to look away. It is not enough. It never can be. The damage done to a life cannot be undone by remembrance. But it matters, because silence is what power wants, and naming is an act of defiance. So their stories are told again, not as fairy tales, but as warnings, not as history, but as memory. And somewhere, in some castle long forgotten, the stones begin to hum, as if they too remember, as if the silence is finally breaking. Some were crowned but never ruled. Others were married but never touched. A few were buried before their titles could be spoken aloud. They were called queens in whispers, only briefly and always conditionally. Their reigns, if you could call them that, lasted days, sometimes hours. Their names were printed on betrothal scrolls and spoken in court ceremonies, only to be scratched out when the alliance failed, or the husband died, where the politics shifted like sand beneath their feet. They were queens that never were. One died on her wedding night, her small body unable to withstand what the throne demanded. Another was left in a convent after her fiancé married someone richer. A third was promised 3 crowns, Castile, Aragon, and Portugal, but inherited nothing but a locked room and a broken lineage. They were groomed for glory, taught to dance, to kneel, to speak 5 languages, to smile without baring their teeth. They could recite scripture and genealogy like poetry. They learned which fork to use at which course, how to turn their head in a portrait so that the shadows soften their chin. But they were never taught how to survive irrelevance. Their value existed only in potential. The promise of an heir, the possibility of a peaceful union, the illusion of continuity. When that promise shattered, through stillbirth, infertility, scandal, war, they became burdens, and burdens were banished. One was imprisoned for speaking against a marriage contract, another for refusing to sleep with her husband. One young girl was declared mad for crying too often. She had been queen for 10 days. The ink on her coronation papers hadn't even dried. These were not the powerful matriarchs of empires, the rulers etched into coin and canvas. These were the almosts, the maybes, the forgotten links in royal chains. They carried the same weight, wore the same jewels, bore the same expectations. But when they broke beneath it, no one mourned them. Their stories were too inconvenient, too sad, too common. History prefers clarity, kings and queens. But these women existed in the in-between, not powerful enough to shape their world, not powerless enough to be pitied. They were reminders that monarchy is not majesty. It is machinery. Cold, ruthless, indifferent to the bodies it grinds down. And yet, they linger. Their names resurface in letters scratched onto the backs of paintings, buried in parish records. Notations like betrothed but died before ceremony, or title annulled, or simply vanished. But in these margins, something else pulses, a kind of quiet resistance, a refusal to fully disappear. Because even if they never ruled, they were there. They breathed the same palace air. They walked the same marbled corridors. They looked into the same mirrors and asked the same questions. What am I if not queen? What remains when the crown is taken or never given? What remains is the truth, not of power, but of survival, not of thrones, but of thorns. These were the queens that never were. But their stories, unfinished, unjust, unbearable, still matter because they revealed the cost of crowns, the cost of silence, the cost of being a girl in a world ruled by kings. It was never just politics. Every treaty signed, every border redrawn, every throne secured, behind it was a girl, or rather, the body of a girl, not in metaphor, but in flesh, carried across countries like cargo, paraded through gates to smiling crowds who did not know her name, draped in gold-threaded gowns too heavy for her bones, married to strangers who had already memorized her dowry, but not her face. She did not vote. She did not speak in council, but her body made empires, and it broke them. This was the hidden arithmetic of monarchy, the quiet math of blood and womb. A girl's fertility could decide a century. Her failure could end a dynasty. Her miscarriage might ignite 2 kingdoms into war. Her stillbirth could ignite rebellion. Her silence could sustain peace. History records the names of kings and generals. It honors treaties and dates. It sketches the outlines of empires in clean, sharp ink. But beneath that ink, soaked into the parchment, is the blood of girls who were too young to consent, too scared to speak, too obedient to survive. Their pain was policy. At 5, they were taught to kneel. At 10, they were betrothed.
At 12, they were told to bear heirs, and at 15, they were expected to have delivered sons or explanations. There were no victories for them, only survival. And even that came at a cost. Some bled to death in bridal beds. Some bled every month with no child to show for it. Some bled during secret abortions arranged by desperate handmaidens with trembling hands. Some simply stopped bleeding, and with it, their value. They became infertile, difficult, unfit, and then they were replaced. Not always by another queen, sometimes by silence, sometimes by the grave. But the monarchy endured, the empire marched on, the history books thickened, and in every chapter, if you look closely, you'll find the outline of a girl erased, overwritten, but still there. She is in the margin, in the missing pages, in the gaps between succession lines, in the quiet funerals with no mourners, no markers, in the faces of queens who reigned only in theory, in the eyes of princesses who stopped smiling after their wedding night, in the trembling hands of girls holding sons they weren't allowed to raise. This was the unspoken contract. The girls gave their blood, and the men got to write history. But blood has memory. It stains, it lingers, and now, centuries later, that blood is beginning to speak. Not in screams, but in stories, in the resurrection of forgotten names, in the telling of lives once buried under veils and velvet, in the quiet insistence that these girls were not collateral.